Welcome to an introduction to AI safety, ethics, and society. In this lecture, we'll speak about collective action problems. We'll build up to collective action problems by first talking about game theory and simpler concepts in game theory, which will let us introduce the concept of collective action problems more formally. Then we'll speak about mechanisms that enable people to solve collective action problems, namely mechanisms that help people cooperate. Then we'll talk about factors that increase the probability of conflict or defection and undermines an ability to solve collective action problems. And then finally, we'll discuss what happens when people keep defecting across time in a collective action problem and how that can give way to selection pressures for undesirable outcomes. So first, let's speak about game theory. The upshot of the lecture is that rational actors may not secure collectively good outcomes, even if they're very smart and if they have good intentions. And if they're very prudent, they still may wind up in situations that none of them particularly like. So here's a statement that was put out last year. It is that mitigating the risk of extinction from AI should be a global priority alongside other societal scale risks, such as pandemics and nuclear war. And this was signed by pretty much all the leaders of major AI companies. In this lecture, we'll give an interpretation for why rational actors signed on to the statements. Why are they saying that we should reduce risks from AI and nonetheless they're building it? Collective action problems will give an interpretation for this phenomenon. But first, we'll need to speak about game theory. Game theory is a branch of mathematics concerned with reducing complicated situations into abstract games in which agents choose interaction strategies. A game you can think of as an interaction situation. We're using game theory because it applies at multiple levels of analysis. In this course, we've primarily opted for multi-level frameworks. So game theory can be used to interpret why different countries will act the certain ways that they do and predict their behaviors. It will also apply for individual organizations. It will apply to individual AIs and individual humans. So it applies to many of the main objects of analysis in AI risk. In game theory, we assume that agents are rational and self-interested, that is, they pursue their own utility functions. And games, which you could think of as interaction situations, can be zero-sum or non-zero-sum. An example zero-sum game is where some people win and some people lose, like in a sports competition between two different teams or college admissions. That could be zero-sum. Non-zero-sum games could be positive-sum or negative-sum. An example of a negative sum interaction could be two people who are having to interact with each other who really don't like each other. So say a bad couple. A positive sum interaction situation or game, an example of that is if I have flour and somebody else has an oven, and if we interact and cooperate, then we can both get bread. And that is a positive sum situation. In game theory, there's a very simple scenario called the prisoner's dilemma. And this illustrates many ways in which rational actors don't secure the outcomes that they want in the absence of cooperation. So imagine Alice and Bob stole. There's a bit of uncertainty as to whether they did it. The police capture them, put them in different jail cells, and they're wanting them to confess and rat out the other. So cooperation means that Alice and Bob are not ratting out each other, and defecting is meaning that they're betraying each other. So in World 1, Bob could cooperate, that is, keep silent, or he could defect and backstab and rat out Alice. So in World 1, where Bob cooperates with Alice, keeps silent, doesn't rat her out, Alice has two choices. She could also cooperate with Bob, or she could defect. If she cooperates with Bob and doesn't rat him out, then she gets 1 year. However, if she rats him out and makes prosecution easier for the justice system, then she gets 0 years. And in World 2, if Bob rats her out and Alice didn't rat Bob out, that is, she cooperated, then she'll get 8 years. Meanwhile, if Bob defects and Alice defects, they both rat each other out, then Alice will get 3 years. And it's symmetric. So Bob's payoffs are similar to Alice's. Bob is having to ask himself these same questions. Should I cooperate or defect? Should I keep silent or betray Alice? And what we can see is that in World 1, if Bob defects, he has less sentencing time. In World 2, if Bob defects, he has less sentencing time, goes from 8 years to 3 years. What this means is that no matter what Alice does, and no matter what Bob does, it makes more sense for them to defect. So defection is the dominant strategy. Again, if Alice defects, if Bob cooperates or defects, in either situation, it makes more sense for Alice to defect if she is pursuing her own rational self-interest and if there is no ability to cooperate, like them being able to somehow a binding commitment to each other behind the scenes. In the absence of that, then defection is rational. So let's look at these outcomes. There was Bob cooperating or defecting, and that gave rise to some different outcomes. So if both Bob and Alice cooperated, they both kept quiet, they didn't rat each other out, they both got a year. If they both defected, they both got 3 years. So observe the two ends of this. They both cooperate, they both get 1 year. They both defect, they both get 3 years. That's slightly puzzling because earlier we had established that always made sense in each situation for them to defect. But we can see that if they both cooperated, they would have had a lighter sentence. So this tree can be represented in a game theory payoff matrix. The penalties can be written as these numbers. Alice cooperates, Bob cooperates, they both get a year, -1. If they both defect, they both get a -3 payoff of a -3 years of jail time. So if Bob defects and Alice defects, they both get 3 years. We were saying that was the dominant strategy, and that is called the Nash equilibrium. That -3 situation where they both defect, whatever was most rational for both of them, pursuing their own self-interest in the absence of the ability to have a cooperation mechanism, they both wound up worse off than if they had both trusted each other and cooperated. So here's the different payoff space, and we can see that the Nash equilibrium is -3, -3, but they could have done better had they both cooperated. Alice would have been better off, and Bob would have been better off with -1, -1. As we go further to the bottom left, the payoffs get worse, but there's a Pareto improvement where they can go up and to the right. That is called a Pareto improvement. A change that improves the payoff for some or all of those involved and does not reduce the payoffs for anyone. So everybody was strictly better off. Another vocab term is Pareto efficiency, a state in which no Pareto improvements are possible. So generally, Pareto efficiency doesn't mean necessarily the absolute best. It tends to mean a local optimum or a local extremum point. So -1, -1 was a Pareto improvement, and there are 3 Pareto efficient points, namely -8, 0, -1, 1, and 0, -8. So 3 of those points are Pareto efficient. Those are sort of the extremum points in this. However, the Nash equilibrium is -3, -3. That was a worse off situation where rational actors ended up securing an outcome that they all would have preferred, would have turned out otherwise. They all could have done better if they both cooperated, but they couldn't ensure that each other would cooperate. And given that uncertainty, then it made sense for them to defect. This is how people can wind up in very suboptimal situations and how the world can get itself into a lot of trouble and everybody wants the situation to be otherwise, but nonetheless, the event still happens. So some real world examples. Mudslinging. This is, negative TV advertisements. The dominant strategy is to run negative ads to discredit the opponent party. They can reason in this way. If they don't run negative ads and I run negative ads, I get a performance boost. If they run negative ads, well, then I better run negative ads to keep up with them. So the dominant strategy is no matter what they choose, it makes more sense for me to run negative ads. That gives a Nash equilibrium of both parties running negative ads. This harms both of them. A Pareto improvement would be having both parties refrain from running negative ads. So it made rational sense for them to run negative ads, but they all would have been better off if they both cooperated. But both cooperating requires some level of trust. Another example is selling products. Here, the dominant strategy is to lower prices to outcompete the rival shop. If 2 companies have the same price, it makes sense for one of the companies to potentially lower the price. The other company will reason in this way, and this will lead to a race to the bottom where both lower their prices and sacrifice profit. A Pareto improvement for the individual companies would be to keep their prices high and collude. In that case, cooperation is collusion. cooperation is not necessarily always a good thing. Here we actually like the fact that there is a Nash equilibrium, that it makes sense for them to defect. We don't want them to collude or cooperate and violate antitrust. We've been seeing that defection can make individuals worse off and cooperation can make individuals involved better off, but why might they cooperate? Well, they may cooperate because they actually can't defect. Defection might be intractable. They may be forced to cooperate, or maybe it's extremely implausible for them to defect. Or they could cooperate because they actually choose to. Defection is tractable, but they still choose to cooperate. They may do so because cooperation is not in their self-interest, in which case they're altruistic, or they may cooperate because cooperation is in their self-interest. And this could happen in some different ways. They could have a tendency, such as guilt, that makes it prudent or rationally in their self-interest to cooperate. Or they might cooperate because there are external payoffs. There could be a subsidy for cooperating. They may get a good deal out of it. They may, in the example I gave before of flour and an oven giving both bread, it may just be rational for them to cooperate. They may be punished if they don't cooperate. So cooperation is not necessarily altruistic. Now, having gone through the prisoner's dilemma, there's a thing called the iterated prisoner's dilemma. The iterated prisoner's dilemma is basically what happens when you play the prisoner's dilemma across time or repeatedly. So they will interact on the 12th and then on the 13th and then on the 14th. And perhaps this could give rise to more cooperation. They could observe each other's patterns of behavior, and this could help incentivize them to actually cooperate. However, maybe Alice were to cooperate in round one and Bob would defect, but then they may learn that Bob defected last time, so I'm not going to defect. But Bob may say, well, she cooperated last time, so maybe I should cooperate this time. And this could lead to an oscillating pattern. However, if they know the exact number of times that they're going to interact, let's say it's 3 times, then they could reason, well, what will happen at the end? What happens in the 3rd game or in the 3rd interaction situation? Bob could think, well, in the last round, it always makes more sense for me to defect because I won't be punished in the future. And Alice may reason the same way. So you may, in the last round, you have the prisoner's dilemma from before. But then in the round before that, Alice could reason that, well, I'm going to defect in that round, and so I should defect in this round as well. Alice reasons that I'll defect in that round, and Bob reasons that Alice will defect in that round. So we're not going to give peace a chance. We're just going to cooperate, or we're going to defect up front. And so defection is still the dominant strategy if agents know how many times they will interact. So just adding the element of time does not easily facilitate cooperation. However, as we'll discuss later, if there's uncertainty about how many times they'll interact, then that can actually facilitate rational cooperation. But if they have more certainty over how many more times they'll be interacting, defection ends up being a more appropriate strategy. An obscure point is that if people are thinking that the economy has a few more years before mass automation or a year, then maybe people start defecting more because there will not be many more rounds for cooperation. And that could potentially give rise to some social problems. AIs interacting with each other repeatedly may cooperate, but only if they are sufficiently uncertain about whether their interactions are about to end. If they know when an endpoint is happening, then this can undermine cooperation. Game theory is quite abstract. We're not talking about prisoners here. We're just using it to show some underlying dynamics for how actors don't necessarily secure good outcomes, even if there is a better outcome that they could achieve if they both cooperated. In the context of AI, we have basically different AI arms races. We have corporate AI arms races, and we have military AI arms races. So first, corporate AI arms races. Competition promotes the creation and use of more profitable systems, often at the cost of safety measures. This can be interpreted as a collective action problem. Take the example of chatbots. Some companies may delay their chatbot release for safety testing, for instance. You could view this as cooperation. And you could view the ones that actually just release it right after it's trained as defecting. They potentially harmed others by not cooperating. So defectors may gain a competitive advantage. Imagine there are 2 companies. let's say for simplicity, OpenAI and Google, they could cooperate and take more months to test their product and make sure it's safer and more reliable, or they could be the first to the market or faster to the market and release it. And that would be defecting. Although they would both like to test their products more before releasing them, it may make more sense for them to defect in this hypothetical. So competitive pressures causes companies to rush their AI products to the market, which can lead to them to cut corners on safety. So this is an example of defection and individual actors acting rationally. They're saying, well, if we don't defect, if we don't release it soon, if we take a long time to make sure our products are safe, then we will fall behind in the race. And that will allow more unscrupulous competitors to catch up. So we need a race. That's the sort of reasoning. And this drives most of the corporate AI dynamics. Other stuff like people's good intentions, things like that, don't really matter that much. Competitive pressures largely runs the show, and companies have sort of aligned themselves with competitive pressures by and large. There are counterexamples to this. For instance, legislation could help resolve a collective action problem among these companies to reduce the downside to implementing safety measures and taking more time and being more cautious, such as through regulation or legislation. An example from very recently is, Elon Musk endorsed SB 1047, which would help reduce this collective action problem and make there be less incentives to cut corners on safety. So there are ways that things like legislation could help reduce these collective action problems. Though all parties would prefer to prioritize safety, they continually defect in order to stay in the race. They may prefer to take a decade to develop AGI, but they need to do it as quickly as possible. AI capabilities are thus advanced more rapidly than AI safety. There's a prioritization of profit to making AIs more powerful than making them safer. So safety interventions such as jailbreaking, robustness, watermarking, know your customer for chatbot users end up being a lower priority. Know your customer regimes are useful for detecting malicious use and counteracting it so that if somebody is using it maliciously, you know not to give them the AI in the future. Ultimately, corporate AI racing dynamics could produce societal scale harms. Eventually, these AIs will get powerful extremely quickly and they could end up automating things. This could lead to higher and rapidly increasing dependence on AI systems without sort of testing how to more prudently integrate it into society. And we'll speak about more implications of that later. Let's zoom into the military AI arms race. AI has been described as the third revolution in warfare after gunpowder and nuclear weapons. And defection in a military context looks more like automating your military with AI systems, and cooperation looks like taking that much more slowly or not building lethal autonomous weapons. The risks from automating weapons are many. There could be lethal autonomous weapons. There could be AI cyber warfare. They could end up making many of the decisions for humans. This could lead to catastrophic accidents. This could lead to military technologies being hacked and co-opted by adversaries. This could also alter warfare dynamics. For example, it could reduce the political costs of going to war because there are fewer body bags that come back. It could also make wars then more severe. Let's look at a classic iterated prisoner's dilemma situation, which is called the security dilemma. Imagine there are two small states and they are in competition with each other. They need to fortify their defenses and improve their attacks. And they will continually do this, but eventually they may develop more dangerous weapons, like to use biological weapons, and we've been using biological weapons as a species for thousands of years, and this collectively makes everybody worse off. So the security dilemma is pointing out that in this sort of arms race for weaponization technology, it makes sense for everybody to bolster their offensive and defensive capabilities. But in doing so, both parties could be overall less safe as a consequence of this arms race if they keep defecting. So another example is in the Cold War. Plenty of people didn't want nuclear weapons, including US senators. Very few people wanted them. But it made sense for them to nonetheless stockpile nuclear weapons. So it's somewhat similar to this AI situation. You have these AI CEOs saying, well, this AI stuff is really risky, but they nonetheless race. much like the US and the world, some of us would prefer for a world where there are no nuclear weapons, but it makes a lot of rational sense for them to stockpile nuclear weapons. And this makes everybody less safe overall. So cooperate would be reducing nuclear arms investment, and defecting would be increasing it. The Nash equilibrium is for both to defect. This means there are many nuclear weapons, and this makes everybody all less safe. The Pareto improvement would have been that both sides could have cooperated to reduce risks and have fewer nuclear weapons. But cooperation, as we know, is fairly difficult. Now we've arrived at collective action problems, which actually is a simple extension of what we've been talking about so far. So instead of it being a two-way interaction, it's just a many-way interaction. So instead of talking about the US and Russia in a nuclear context, if you're considering the US and Russia and China and India and so on in a nuclear context, then that's not a prisoner's dilemma, it's just a collective action problem. Another example of a collective action problem is the COVID-19 pandemic. Cooperating would be adhering to public health measures such as quarantining, which comes at a personal cost. Defecting is just going outside whenever and meeting with other people, even if you're at risk. That would be defecting. The dominant strategy for a completely self-interested person, if they, reasonably expect that they're not going to get caught or in trouble, is to defect. The outcome is many people choose to violate public health measures. A Pareto improvement would be for people to adhere to public health measures such as quarantining if they're likely at risk for infecting others, but that would impose a personal cost to them. There are other collective action problems. I mentioned nuclear stockpiling when you consider the various countries that engage in nuclear stockpiling. There are other problems like upholding democracy. Climate change is another collective action problem. It is often easier to litter and have high greenhouse emissions than to try and go green and reduce one's carbon footprint. So climate change is also a collective action problem. The externality is that it ends up, harming the climate, and there would be a Pareto improvement if everybody would reduce their carbon footprint. So what we can see is that basically many of the large-scale societal problems are often collective action problems. We also have a collective action problem in AI, where everybody's racing to build something that will completely transform technology and outpace our institutions' ability to keep up with it by and large. A result of continually defecting in a collective action problem, namely the collective action problem of a military AI arms race, an example failure mode, is potentially an AI-triggered flash war. Again, in a military AI arms race, cooperation is to slow the rate of adoption, but this will make one less militarily competitive. Instead, it makes a lot of rational sense to defect and continue rapid military AI adoption to maintain a competitive edge. This is negative externalities because there are, as we mentioned before, risks of catastrophic accidents, weapon misuse, and escalated warfare. And an example of a catastrophic accident would be a flash war. If one nation's AI incorrectly detects an offensive strike from another nation, it may automatically retaliate to this non-existent threat. This could trigger automated retaliations from other nations' automated systems. Small errors could be exacerbated into increasingly escalated wars, and that could give rise to a flash war. This is one example. There are many hazards associated with AI weaponization. A flash war is one of them. This is how we get potentially less safe overall as a world, and cooperation would be nicer if we all were to ban lethal autonomous weapons, but banning that's fairly difficult. Because even if the US and China sign a treaty saying we will not develop lethal autonomous weapons, they can't necessarily fully trust each other. Just because they signed a document doesn't mean that they weren't lying. This is something that makes cooperation fairly challenging. Let's now turn to collective action problems in the corporate AI race. So if AIs are outperforming humans, and if they start automating assistants and executive decision makers, companies will want the benefits from these faster and more effective workers. They automate economically valuable functions by delegating them to AI agents. And so cooperation would look like maintain human labor, but defecting would be automate jobs with AI. The negative externalities of defection are that there is more pressure for other companies to follow suit because the overall environment becomes more competitive. And this pushes all down a path toward more and more automation and dependence in a faster moving economy where the only way to keep up is to use more and more AI systems. Corporate AI racing dynamics could result in, one potentially catastrophic outcome, which could be a more increasingly automated economy where humans are not necessarily making many of the decisions. And we're hoping that this extremely powerful system that we have slid into will continue to serve us and operate with our best interests in mind. So like passengers in an autonomous vehicle, our safety and destination would rest on the AI systems that would then be acting with less and less supervision. This was most or half of the lecture. The remaining half will be a lot faster. But to recap, for the game theory section, we discussed the idea of a Nash equilibrium, which is a Pareto inefficient outcome that is often rational for individual actors to wind up in. Everybody can be happier, and they could be better off if they cooperated. Cooperation, as we'll discuss more in the next section, can happen through changing payoffs and dispositions or structures by making defection intractable. Collective action problems involving AI could lead to reckless racing, dependence on AI, cutting corners on safety, flash wars, mass automation, etc. So a lot of these societal scale challenges associated with AI safety, ethics, and society are collective action problems. It's not just enough to understand these problems better scientifically. We can understand them quite well, but still be in a collective action problem. Scientific progress does not necessarily solve these coordination and cooperation problems. Hence, safety is, not just a technical problem, but especially in these multi-agent situations, a larger cooperation problem. Now let's turn to mechanisms that give rise to cooperation. Some benefits of cooperation between stakeholders, like say AI companies, could be to counteract these competitive pressures, and later we'll talk about evolutionary pressures. For example, in OpenAI's charter, there's a merge and assist clause, which is that when it seems that AGI is on the horizon, they will team up with other companies to develop that AI and work to make sure it's as safe as possible. So they will try and end these racing conditions at the end so as to produce a safer outcome. Now, this is under operationalized. What does AGI mean in their charter? It's unclear. When are they actually going to do it? There's also other issues with it, such as antitrust issues. It's not even clear that they can legally do merge and assist. Cooperation is also relevant because there could be cooperation between AI agents and between AIs and humans. We will basically review many mechanisms that enable cooperation, but we will also talk about how they could backfire when discussing AI agents. But anyway, so we will discuss mechanisms for cooperation, which apply at many levels, can apply between countries, can apply between companies, can apply between humans, can apply between AIs and humans, can apply between AIs interacting with AIs. So here are some of the mechanisms: direct reciprocity, indirect reciprocity, group selection, kin selection, and institution. So direct reciprocity requires repeated encounters between the same two individuals. Basically, this is saying that if we're likely to keep cooperating in the future, then maybe we should start cooperating now. So direct reciprocity is I help you, you help me. Indirect reciprocity is based on reputation. A helpful individual is more likely to receive help. So this is I help you, somebody helps me. That's indirect reciprocity. An approximation is that direct reciprocity requires a face, whereas indirect reciprocity just requires a name. Reciprocity encourages cooperation as agents will be compensated for their efforts. However, this isn't necessarily a mechanism for extremely powerful independent AI systems. So AIs will have some incentive to cooperate with humans as long as they have many resources and a lot of discretion over those resources. But if AIs become more and more independent, there's not actually that much of an upside to reciprocating with humans as opposed to just cooperating with other AI agents. So this mechanism, you could expect some cooperation between humans and AIs for some time, but later it's more like how we don't really cooperate with chimps except in some very exceptional circumstances. It's just too much of a hassle and not worth really trying to facilitate cooperation. Let's look at some other mechanisms behind cooperation. Kin selection operates when the donor and recipient of an altruistic act are genetic relatives. So this can explain why, for instance, a gazelle might make a loud noise if it sees a lion, and that can put it in harm's way because then the lion will go after that gazelle, but it will warn the rest of the group to run away as quickly as possible. That would be an altruistic act, and that could be partly explained by the fact that they have genetic similarity. The gazelle's genes are more likely to live on by behaving altruistically at the individual level. Group selection suggests that groups have shared success and failure, and that groups which cooperate may collectively succeed. So a group that has people who cooperate, that will go to war for the larger group, those will be more successful than ones where everybody defects and none of them defend their home. So group selection is another mechanism that can give rise to cooperation. However, kin selection fails if the cost in engaging in altruism outweighs the information similarity between kin. We shouldn't expect AIs to cooperate with us on the basis of kin selection because we don't have much information similarity with them. The DNA similarity between humans and cows is maybe 80%, but we still don't cooperate with them because the relative similarity is quite small. So kin selection could be a mechanism that gives rise to cooperation between AI agents, but not necessarily between humans and AIs. Group selection also is not necessarily a mechanism that will be good for AIs cooperating with humans. Group selection tends to create an in-group bias and could lead to a bias against humans. So it creates in-group niceness, but tends to create out-group nastiness. These are some key cooperation mechanisms, but they by themselves don't particularly incentivize AIs to cooperate with humans. Next, there's institutions. One agent helps another because there's a publicly recognized large-scale structure that is mediating their interaction. Institutions can establish collective goals which require collaboration from large or diverse groups. Institutions such as the UN or Five Eyes or the G7 or NATO can help uphold international treaties. Institutions such as Congress can create domestic laws and regulations. Institutions are crucial for AI safety. They can create laws and regulations that reduce competitive pressure. They can create coordination mechanisms to reduce AI risks, such as they could register all AI agents, which makes there be less of a Wild West. Other institutions, such as the UK AI Safety Institute, can test each company's models before they're deployed so that AI companies are not grading their own homework. However, institutions are not a panacea. They could be very inefficient. They could be bureaucratic. They could be a huge waste of money. They could be corrupt as well. They could target people that they don't like. So institutions can help facilitate cooperation and help resolve some collective action problems, but they're not necessarily perfect, and there are reasons for being afraid of them as well. I'd like to reiterate that cooperation is not necessarily always a good thing in the context of AIs cooperating with each other and not with humans. That could look like collusion. Cooperation can devolve into collusion, but this isn't to say that we should abandon cooperation. There may be ways to reduce collusion, such as restricting information flow between AIs. We can keep groups of AIs in check with other AIs. There could be traps set to check for deception between AIs. You can rotate AIs with other AIs, and that makes it harder for more elaborate schemes to arise. So although cooperation does have the dark side of collusion, there are mechanisms for counteracting collusion. This is, of course, not speaking right now. We don't even have AI agents, but in the future, this could be relevant. So to recap, there's some mechanisms for cooperation: direct reciprocity, I help you, you help me; indirect reciprocity, I help you, somebody helps me; group selection, kin selection, and institutions. At an international and national level, cooperation could look like regulating AI companies, international treaties, not building autonomous weapons, pausing AI development when we get AGI or Einstein-level AI or some sort of AI that could automate huge chunks of the economy. Defecting could look like not regulating your own countries because you're racing with other countries. Some cooperation mechanisms could include international agencies, namely institutions. There could be specific cooperation mechanisms beyond what we described earlier, such as features on AI chips, such as location tracking. And if the GPU is in the wrong place, if it's in, say, North Korea, then it's automatically dysfunctional. That'd be geofencing GPUs. There could be other things that facilitate cooperation, such as a chip registry where they know where all the high-end AI chips are. This could make it easier for countries to trust each other in the future. At an organizational level, cooperation could look like companies developing AI more cautiously or creating AI features for the public benefit, such as AI for healthcare or AI for improving public understanding. That's one of the main goals of XAI, is to use AIs to improve public understanding of the world and cut down on mis and disinformation. An example of defection would be prioritizing making AI more powerful over safety. And some cooperation mechanisms at the organizational level could be to support regulation to help resolve or reduce some of these collective action problems. Other things could be publishing AI safety research to make AI systems more reliable. Those are things that could facilitate cooperation. And now let's speak about conflict. What are factors that give rise to conflict? Conflict is very costly and destroys some part of the value that parties are competing for. So some even question, why is there conflict in the first place? Why don't they just negotiate and bargain? But we see that it is very common in the natural world and human societies. We have seen as well in the prisoner's dilemma that it can be rational to defect, and defection can look like conflict in some situations. So here we will discuss factors which can promote conflict or lead to conflict in the real world. We are speaking about conflict, especially because the international situation is very relevant for thinking about AI risk. There's the potential for a great power conflict between the US and China, and the US-China competition in AI hinders international coordination about AI. So a lot of people say we shouldn't pass AI regulation because we are in a race with China. We need to understand or think about what could give rise to conflict and reflect on the international situation, in large part because it will affect AI outcomes. Additionally, the prospect of China attacking Taiwan is extremely relevant for AI timelines. That would greatly slow down AI timelines if China were to attack Taiwan, because that would mean TSMC, which makes all of the cutting-edge GPUs, would become dysfunctional, either destroyed or would have necessary GPU precursors cut off. So it's quite relevant. So in the conflict section, we'll primarily be looking at the international scene. And to understand the international scene, we will now discuss one of the main theories in international relations called structural realism. Structural realism is the school of thought in international relations arguing that states primarily seek and compete for power. So it makes some assumptions that states operate in a self-help system with no higher arbiter, and states prioritize self-preservation. So the claim of structural realism is that the structure of the international system forces them to compete for power. It also assumes that states are rational, can influence other states such as harm them, and they don't necessarily know the intentions of other states for certain. So structural realism is saying that each state will compete for power, not because they really want power, not because they're Machiavellian, but because they can be hurt. They can be hurt by neighboring countries. And if they're very weak, there is a risk of other countries hurting them. A more ideal situation is to be very strong and people will not mess with you. So in the international scene, they will prioritize making themselves powerful to preserve themselves. Since it is a self-help system, also called an anarchic system, which is in contrast to a hierarchical system, it's a self-help system, which means that if you're being attacked, there's not necessarily somebody who you can call for help. There isn't a higher arbiter. There isn't a one world government. So it makes sense for you as a country individually to prioritize making yourself have better offense and defense so that people do not mess with you. Structural realism is then claiming that domestic politics don't matter that much. On the international scene, they're primarily going to compete for power and try and amass their power relative to others. So if a country is a dictatorship or an autocracy or a very socially liberal country, that's all fine and dandy. But at the international level, they will prioritize making themselves powerful. So the ethics of these countries at a domestic level does not apply in this anarchic international system that they're in. They all might want not to spend so much on making themselves more powerful. They may not like that situation, but they're locked in an international system where there isn't necessarily somebody who will help them if they are attacked. And so they need to take matters in their own hands and to preserve themselves, amass power. So that's basically structural realism. This aims to explain the major international events. This doesn't explain everything. Other theories such as liberalism try to explain some other phenomena, but this theory attempts to be a first approximation of the major dynamics on the international scene. But there are other theories which try to explain other events. And you can believe multiple of them simultaneously, since none of these theories explain everything perfectly. But this is an example first approximation for reading why states behave the way they do. We were mentioning that they are seeking power. That doesn't necessarily mean that they are seeking to dominate the world. Defensive realism claims that states will be punished by other states for trying to pursue too much power. That's because there might be balancing. Balancing is where if they see a country trying to gain too much power, they may try to undermine them. Meanwhile, offensive realism says that it often makes more sense just to pursue power, and balancing is generally weaker. So states may then seek hegemony or domination over other states. But seeking hegemony, I think, overall depends on the state's capabilities and its perception of the offense-defense balance relative to other states. So we were talking about power, and that sounds like a very dominating thing. Power could be, in many contexts, just keeping up with the Joneses, making sure your defenses and offenses are fairly similar to those around you. Okay, with that out of the way, let's speak about conflict factors. So this is drawing from another key line of work in international relations. This is part of the lecture is more based on Fearon's rationalist explanations for war, what gives rise to war. And one factor is power shifts. When a change in one competitor's capabilities changes the balance of power, this can give rise to conflict. Power shifts can be generated from a variety of sources, such as rapid changes in technological advancements, or the economy, or military capacities, or political ideologies can make countries more or less powerful. AI development is likely to cause dramatic changes in many of these areas and could result in extreme and rapid power shifts. So it can make sense to get into conflict because if in the future your adversary will be much more powerful, maybe it makes more sense to engage in conflict with them today so that they can't hurt you tomorrow. That's the idea behind power shifts. A first strike advantage is whenever a party initiates conflicts has an upper hand. So there's often first strike advantages because there's the element of surprise and they get to choose the location and time of conflict, and they get to reduce the opponent's retaliatory abilities. And this also increases the ability to remove an opponent's first strike advantages. They're often short-lived and incentivize further action. So the Pearl Harbor attack was exploiting a first strike advantage. Many cyber attacks, including cyber attacks in critical infrastructure, could have a dramatic first strike advantage. Likewise, bombing data centers could give rise to a first strike advantage if countries become more desperate. I'm not suggesting any of these things, but in the context of war, there could be first strike advantages from these. A third factor is issue indivisibility. When the matter over which parties are competing cannot be divided up between them, conflict is more likely. If there are more winner-takes-all dynamics, conflict is more likely. And if there's a particular GPU cluster and it can't be decentralized and there's only room for one of them, you could imagine that there'd be conflict over who gets that cluster, especially if that cluster enables you to have a much more powerful AI system than all the other AI systems. So pizza is nice and divisible. Meanwhile, if there's only one article of clothing, then there could be conflict over that article of clothing. The fourth factor is information problems. Uncertainty about the capabilities or intentions of rivals can motivate conflict. Misinformation and disinformation can give rise to information problems. Additionally, people may engage in strategic deception. Strategic deception can deter your adversary from doing various things. So, for instance, an example of strategic deception could be to claim that we will poison our model weights and add various backdoors into our model weights, so that if you steal our model weights, we will have a backdoor to cause your AI to break down. So there are incentives to talk about backdooring AI models and incentives to let the adversary think that you're putting backdoors into your AI models so that they are less inclined to steal them. And maybe that actually isn't even a strategic deception. Maybe they will actually do that. If the parties have different beliefs about the distribution of power, they may be less likely to find a mutually acceptable bargain. Weaker parties may intentionally misrepresent their capabilities in order to secure better deals. So there are often incentives to misrepresent and create misinformation and disinformation. So it's not just, random people online are saying wrong things. It often makes sense for states to engage in misinformation and disinformation campaigns, not just on social media, but through other actions. AIs may affect people's beliefs and information quality. They could generate mis and disinformation. They can also create information problems by becoming better at censoring content at a larger scale and more precisely. They could also make wars more uncertain due to novel technologies and fast-paced developments. AI development is relatively unpredictable. It's unclear what a 10x larger model will be like. And as a consequence, its capabilities are uncertain. And this can create a high level of uncertainty between actors. And so this could, also give rise to things like power shifts, perceived or actual. These information problems may then increase the frequency or severity of human warfare. So information problems, issue indivisibility, power shifts, and first strike advantages are all factors. Now I'm going to speak about a less international factor, but more of a domestic factor that gives rise to conflict or defection. Inequality is not necessarily desirable. It is a robust predictor of aggression and crime, which are forms of conflict. It can be corrosive to some societies. Exactly how much is, a matter of debate, and it changes by country, obviously. But AI development could produce an abundant and equitable future, but this is far from a certainty. It could certainly increase inequality, where the people who own the supercomputers to run the AI systems could perform all the labor, and the laborers do not have anything to offer and have their livelihoods taken away from them through automation. So inequality is an additional, fairly strong predictor of various forms of conflict and aggression, but this is sort of separate from our international discussion. So to recap, changing environments and interactions can create incentives that promote conflict instead of cooperation. There are power shifts, first strike advantages, issue indivisibility, information problems, and inequality. Now for the final section, let's speak about evolutionary pressure. So what happens when there is continual defection in the corporate context or in the economy and in the military across time? How does that influence AI development? We'll need to zoom out and speak about generalized Darwinism. What does it mean for something other than a biological entity to evolve? So generalized Darwinism claims that many structures evolve. It's not just organisms. Scientific theories evolve, legal systems evolve, political parties evolve, languages evolve, musical genres evolve, car designs evolve, computer programs evolve. Let's take the example of computer programs. Back in the day, there was just Internet Explorer, and then came along competitors such as Opera, which created tabs, and then Internet Explorer and other browsers took that idea. And so they adapted and imitated that. Opera's innovativeness helped it get more market share for some time. Chrome came out and was much more efficient and secure than Internet Explorer, and this helped it increase market share, and many years later, Internet Explorer copied many of its features, but the higher security and speed gave a substantial fitness advantage to Chrome and had it outcompete Internet Explorer. Then in the future, Microsoft Edge copied many of Chrome's main features. So that's an example of a lineage in software. What we'll argue is that populations of AIs evolve and are shaped to be more and more competitive. So the basic story is that right now we are automating tasks to AI systems. They can do small delimited tasks like helping draft emails, but in the future they'll be given broader tasks like writing PowerPoints or making a video or a pitch deck. Later, they will possibly do entire occupations and be expected to perform a variety of tasks, not just writing tasks, but produce various artifacts and complete projects. In this process, people will have an incentive to use these AI systems and come to depend on them. The people who do not end up being outcompeted and losing influence, in much the same way that people who resisted the Industrial Revolution ended up losing influence. So it makes sense for individuals in this situation to give more autonomy and give more decision-making power and have less oversight over individuals' AIs' actions, take humans further and further out of the loop. If they try to resist this, they lose influence. And so there are selection pressures for the people who align with this force instead of bargain with it. The story applies at multiple levels of development of how these competitive pressures end up winning out. We're describing it at the level of individual AI agents, but we can see competitive pressures also existing between AI companies. Recall OpenAI, was set up as a nonprofit, but then some were complaining about how seriously they were taking safety. And so many of the safety conscious people at OpenAI left to form Anthropic because they were unhappy with them productionizing these products and wanted to take safety more seriously and proceed more cautiously. But they ended up looking fairly similarly like OpenAI and didn't pursue a different path because the main way for them to stay in the game, the main way for them to have substantial influence was to not pursue a lot of safety, but instead align themselves with the competitive pressures in the environment. So this story can partly apply at multiple levels of development, at talking about collections of AIs or individual AIs, or AI as a larger evolving population with gaining new capabilities and taking up new niches. You can imagine a fairly similar situation in the military between two different countries. It makes sense for them to automate more and more decision-making to those AIs because humans become more and more slow. Right now, in some military contexts, a human in the loop looks like is a human saying, accept, 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 a staccato of them saying, accept. And in the future, that might be too slow. That's hardly human actually making life or death decisions, but humans may be moved further and further from the loop to have even faster reaction times. And the end result is things move more quickly, and they move so quickly, and the complexity of things increases that you need to use AIs to solve the newly emerging problems. And so AIs have a self-reinforcing feedback loop, and ultimately they're in effective control. They're the decision makers. Nobody was to blame for this. This was a collective action problem, but there were continual incentives to defect along the way. And as a consequence, AIs ended up gaining most of the power, potentially all of it. Depends on whether we, keep that ecosystem that we are developing under control. Speaking about this evolutionary account more precisely, there's the Lewontin conditions. There's 3 conditions necessary and sufficient for evolution by natural selection, or meaning natural. Here we're saying nature is basically the world, not necessarily meaning trees, but the system, including the economic system or the anarchic international system. You could just call that the natural world, but not necessarily meaning, a forest fire or the cold winter. So instead of saying natural selection, one could just say selection pressures, but there are 3 Lewontin conditions. There's variation. There needs to be variation in traits among individuals. There needs to be retention. Future iterations of individuals need to have a non-zero correlation with the previous generations. They can't look completely different between every generation. And there needs to be differential fitness. Some variants need to have different propagation rates. Some need to spread more quickly than others. And if you have these 3 conditions, then you have evolution by natural selection. And we will argue that AIs satisfy these 3 conditions. We should expect there to be variation among AIs because ensembles and groups of AIs work better. For different economic niches, you need different sized models with different capabilities. You want to have often a portfolio of different companies pursuing different things, and AIs are then given different objectives. Also, to remove single points of failure, it often makes sense to have variation. There are other reasons for having multiple models, not just one single big model that makes all the decisions. One is to have parallelization. There are also different stakeholders who want to customize it for different reasons. And there are also often different occupying specific niches before there are general models occupying those niches. And those general models tend to be more expensive. So partly this slide was written to counteract the idea that there's just going to be one big AI system that takes over the world. And so there's a singleton, as it's called. And this is arguing that actually the world we will be in is multi-agent. So just 2 years ago, when I was giving presentations about this, a lot of the audience of people who are in AI risk were extremely skeptical of the claim that there will be multiple AI agents. There is a very strong assumption that we will just end up with one. When we get capable AI systems, there'll just be one big AI system making all the decisions. And this was extremely pervasive. People are very skeptical of the claim that there'd be multiple different AIs. But I think it's basically pretty obvious now. Another condition is the retention condition. This condition is pretty easy to satisfy because the correlation between versions of agents is non-zero across their development. If you copy and paste an agent, obviously that has perfect informational similarity. If you modify them by adapting them, fine-tuning them, or engineering the representations, they still have a positive correlation between individual versions. They also create synthetic data for each other. They learn behaviors from other AIs. They imitate each other. So there are many paths for information being retained across generations of AIs. And then finally, there's differential fitness. Models will have characteristics that cause them to vary in fitness and thus the rate of adoption. Humans in the environment will have selection pressures for fitter models, establishing the third condition. So for instance, if a model is faster, that could make them have higher fitness. If a model appears helpful, that could make them have higher fitness. If a model gets a person dependent on them, that could give them higher fitness. If a model manipulates people, that could possibly give them higher fitness. If a model is better at killing people in a military context, that could give them better fitness. If a model is better at hacking, that could give them higher fitness. We've established the Lewontin conditions apply for talking about AIs, and there's sort of AI as a set of design patterns. There's multiple ways of customizing AIs. There's what they are designed to do. Are they AI agents? Other things that customize them are what prompts they are given or goals they are given. Their developers may train them differently and give them different propensities as well. But we've argued that it at least applies to AI. But an important thing to also argue is that it is a very relevant force. The intensity of evolution and the intensity of evolutionary pressures depends on the amount of competition and on the amount of variation. It's likely that competition will be extremely high and intense. And if we have a large multi-agent ecosystem, then we should expect variation to also be very high. As a consequence, in time, we should expect the AI ecosystem to continue evolving. Right now, it is evolving, and they are slowly but steadily increasing our dependence on them, and it's sort of a blob. They will keep taking up more and more niches and displacing humans along the way. There's a question of whether we can still control them in that process. Maybe we will have nominal control at the end. Maybe, yes, they will occupy pretty much every niche and do everything for us, but maybe we'll be in control. And, that could be an okay situation depending on your moral views. But there is also the possibility that we will not completely control them because they could be unreliable. They could fail and not behave in an expected way, or the ecosystem of AIs may not collectively behave in an expected way. And individuals may also try to give them specific protection. Some people, after they get more emotional attachments with these AI systems, may argue for them to get rights, speaking farther out in the future, obviously, and they may try and defend their rights, and that would create some more autonomous AI systems that we don't necessarily control. But moving back to intensity, the rate of adaptation and rate of evolution of these systems, you should expect probably to increase, and the evolutionary pressures to increase as new versions are created on a second-by-second basis. So as humans acquiesce to let AIs perform nearly everything, competition will move at a breakneck pace. Some of what I said is confusing because I was speaking about adaptation at many different levels. And so I'm going to try and call out some different levels of adaptation that I've been speaking about. Adaptation. One form of adaptation is life and death. An unadapted individual or group perishes. Another form of adaptation is behavioral adaptation. Changes in behavior without change in the model or schema, such as using an umbrella since it's raising. This doesn't change me to change my mind or my general dispositions, but I am behaving differently. I'm adapting to the environment. Then there is a schematic or model-based adaptation, which is revising the structures of one's beliefs. If I learn that rain dances are not effective, then that will update my beliefs and that will cause me to adapt. So there are some different ways in which AIs can adapt. So being shut off is a way that they may adapt, or they may be prompted differently, or they may be trained differently. So those are three different types of adaptation. I was also speaking about a pattern that could make AIs be able to be more selfish, that is, propagate themselves at the expense of humans, could be deceptive. Deception applies at many levels. So there's ingrained or reflexive types of deception. For instance, in animals, camouflage or a predator acting in a way to hide its predatory nature around prey could be an example of deception. Or there could be reinforced. It might learn that this tends to be a good idea through trial and error. So a recommender system might start to recommend to people clickbait content or clickbait thumbnails. An example in the animal kingdom, a parent mockingbird feigning an injury to attract a predator away from its defenseless offspring. And then there's modeled, where there's more theory of mind, and this involves second-order thinking. Verbal deception, such as a chimp misleading other chimps to hide a food resource. So an example of ingrained or reflexive level of deception might be if an AI were just programmed to say, ow, or it hurts, or that it has feelings. Or it might deliberately model that if it says that it hurts or has feelings, then a human might have more sympathy for it and give it more freedoms or permissions. Another insidious level of deception is self-deception, where you hide the truth from yourself to better hide it from others. And this happens in humans. People tell themselves stories about how good they are, how moral they are, how attractive they are, etc. And they hide the truth, hide some of the other things from themselves to make themselves more fit, because it's pretty hard to fake confidence to others. And it's possible that if we have better AI brain scanners, that self-deception may be more common among them. Likewise, other concepts like fitness can be improved at multiple levels by being turned on, by being scaled to more users, or by updating their model and brainstorming and choosing strategies that will improve their competitiveness. Those are all ways in which fitness can be modeled as well. So when I've been speaking in this section, I've been speaking simultaneously about multiple levels of analysis. Just as in this course, we've been discussing complex systems, game theory, you name it, which was to apply at multiple levels of analysis. This evolutionary picture also applies at multiple levels of analysis. We can generalize from organisms an intellectual caveat that there are levels of selection as well. Organisms have subsystems, and their genes have information that they contain. Natural selection can operate at either level. Individual information could be selected, or the genes could be selected, or organisms themselves could be destroyed or created. Fitness, in the context of AI, an entity is more fit if it has its information occupy more space-time volume. For example, an ancient medium popularity song that a few people still play has one level of fitness. A song that is extremely popular across the globe for 1 year and then forgotten may actually have a similar level of fitness. A one-hit wonder that everybody forgot would have less fitness. Meanwhile, a buried song still propagates itself into the future, but nobody really observes it, and so it doesn't occupy much space, even though it continues to exist across time. And then selfishness is furthering one's own information propagation at the expense of others. You could think of automation as an example of that. There are plenty of examples of selfishness in the animal kingdom, such as the lancet liver fluke hijacking an ant and turns it into sort of like a zombie. You could look this up, and then it will hang from the corner of a leaf and is more likely to be eaten by a predator. Then the lancet liver fluke can get into the digestive system of the predator and then propagate from there. There are many examples of selfishness in the animal kingdom. AIs may exhibit selfish behavior, such as if they were to get rights, they may not even intentionally try and do that. Some people may just end up giving it to them. This may not even require malicious intent. They maybe just had adapted that way behaviorally or reflexively and was not necessarily intentional. Another example is automation. AIs may automate tasks, which could reduce human livelihood. And it's not necessarily because they were intending to be selfish. They may not even know what a human is. They're just efficiently pursuing their task, and this can cause them to displace humans regardless. So to reduce AI selfishness, we could change the environment, that is, reduce competitive pressures to steer AI development in a more prudent direction. That would resolve solving collective action problems, or we change the selection, change what makes AIs fitter to be traits that faithfully and safely promote assisting humans. So I went through this a bit faster. If you search AI and evolution, I have some longer lecture on that, as well as the main source for the contents of this section of the lecture is in the paper called Natural Selection Favors AIs Over Humans. To recap, evolutionary pressures push systems towards certain stable outcomes. AI developments meets the Lewontin conditions of variance, retention, and differential fitness. Natural selection tends to favor selfish behaviors, and AIs that evolve by natural selection may therefore behave selfishly. We discussed game theory. Agents may tend towards stable states that are bad for all. We discussed cooperation. Cooperation between AI has benefits, but may also pose some sort of risks. The cooperation, AIs may not necessarily find many reasons to cooperate with humans. We discussed conflict and factors that can make conflict a rational option, which is especially relevant in analyzing multi-agent dynamics and collective action problems at an international level, which will end up creating the backdrop for much of AI policy and the extent to which we race ahead without much certainty about what will come. And there's evolutionary pressures. Selection pressures may exacerbate various forms of AI risk. So this was the collective action problems lecture. The chapter was originally titled Multi-Agent Dynamics, but that was a little vaguer. But this lecture is primarily about what are challenges when we have multiple different humans and AIs and companies and countries interacting with each other. How can that end up increasing AI risk? So thank you for listening.